When Colonel Bradley Kane cornered Navy Lieutenant Ellie Ross in the remote weather station at 2,000 meters above sea level, he thought her isolation made her vulnerable. What he didn't know was that she had completed SEAL training and was about to demonstrate exactly why his assumption would cost him his career and his arm. This is the story of how one man's predatory behavior met its match against years of elite military conditioning, high-altitude training, and a woman who refused to be anyone's victim. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the Alaskan mountain range as Lieutenant Ellie Ross adjusted the meteorological equipment for the third time that morning. The remote weather monitoring station, perched precariously on Mount Denali's northern face, had been her home for the past 6 weeks. At 2,000 meters above sea level, the air was thin enough to make every breath deliberate, every movement calculated. For most people, the altitude would be debilitating. For Ellie, it was just another day at the office. She had volunteered for this assignment, much to the surprise of her commanding officers. Most personnel viewed the isolated weather station duty as punishment, a place where careers went to die in the endless cycle of atmospheric readings and equipment maintenance. But Ellie saw it differently. After completing her SEAL training 18 months earlier, she craved the solitude and physical challenge that the mountain environment provided. The thin air, extreme weather conditions, and complete isolation from civilization were exactly the kind of obstacles that had forged her into one of the Navy's most capable operators. The station itself was a marvel of military engineering designed to withstand hurricane-force winds and temperatures that could drop to 40 below zero. Solar panels and wind generators provided power to the sophisticated meteorological equipment that fed crucial weather data to military operations across the Pacific Theater. The living quarters were Spartan but functional, consisting of a small kitchen, communications center, sleeping area, and equipment room. Everything was built to military specifications, including the reinforced steel construction that made the entire structure feel like a fortress against the mountain's harsh elements. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Ellie had established a rigid daily routine that kept her sharp and mission-ready. Every morning began with a 3-mile run around the station's perimeter, followed by calisthenics and equipment checks. The afternoon hours were dedicated to data collection and transmission, while evenings were reserved for maintenance tasks and personal training. She practiced her hand-to-hand combat techniques daily, using the station's support beams and equipment as improvised training apparatus. The altitude made every exercise more challenging, but that was exactly what she wanted. SEAL training had taught her that comfort was the enemy of readiness. Her communications with headquarters were scheduled for twice daily, at 0800 and 2000 hours. The satellite uplink provided her only connection to the outside world, and she used it sparingly. Most of her reports were routine weather updates and equipment status checks. Occasionally she would receive updates about personnel rotations or supply drops, but for the most part, she was completely alone with her mission and her thoughts. The isolation didn't bother her. During SEAL training, she had learned to embrace solitude as a tactical advantage. While other candidates struggled with the psychological pressure of extended solo operations, Ellie thrived. She had developed an almost supernatural awareness of her environment, able to detect the slightest changes in weather patterns, equipment performance, or external threats. This heightened sensitivity had saved her life more than once during training exercises, and it had become second nature. What she didn't know was that her isolation had attracted the attention of someone who viewed it as an opportunity rather than a professional assignment. Colonel Bradley Kane had been tracking her assignment through administrative channels, waiting for the perfect moment to make his move. A career officer with 30 years of service, Kane had developed a reputation for inappropriate behavior toward female personnel, but his rank and political connections had always protected him from serious consequences. He saw Ellie's remote posting as the perfect opportunity to act on his predatory instincts without witnesses or interference. Kane had arrived at the station 3 days earlier, claiming to be conducting a routine inspection of remote facilities. His credentials were legitimate, and his arrival had been properly coordinated through military channels. Ellie had no reason to suspect that his visit was anything other than standard operational procedure. She had prepared detailed reports on station operations, equipment maintenance logs, and meteorological data collection procedures. Everything was in perfect order, exactly as she had been trained to maintain it. But Kane's true intentions became clear on the second day of his visit. His questions had gradually shifted from operational matters to personal topics. His comments about her appearance and living conditions had crossed professional boundaries. His physical proximity during equipment demonstrations had become uncomfortably close. Ellie had recognized the warning signs immediately, her SEAL training having prepared her to identify and respond to threats of all kinds. She had begun adjusting her behavior and routines, maintaining professional distance while documenting everything for potential future action. Now, on the third day of his visit, Kane had finally revealed his true purpose. The morning equipment check had been completed, the weather data transmitted to headquarters, and the next scheduled communication wasn't due for another 6 hours. He had chosen his moment carefully, believing that the remote location and his superior rank would give him complete control over the situation. He was about to learn just how wrong he could be. Colonel Bradley Kane had spent decades perfecting his predatory approach, using his rank and authority to intimidate and silence his victims. At 52 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with the weathered appearance of a career military officer. His salt and pepper hair and lined face spoke of years of service, but his cold gray eyes revealed something far more sinister than military discipline. Kane had learned early in his career that remote assignments and isolated duty stations provided the perfect hunting grounds for his twisted desires. His service record was impressive on paper. 3 combat deployments, numerous commendations, and a steady rise through the ranks had earned him respect and fear in equal measure. Fellow officers knew him as demanding but fair, a strict disciplinarian who got results. What they didn't know was that Kane had spent years cultivating a network of favors and blackmail that protected him from the consequences of his actions. Junior officers who had tried to report his behavior had found that their careers derailed, while those who remained silent were rewarded with favorable assignments and promotions. The weather station assignment had come to his attention through routine personnel reports. When he saw that a female SEAL graduate had been assigned to the isolated posting, he knew he had found his next target. Kane had spent weeks planning his approach, coordinating his inspection visit through proper channels to avoid suspicion. His reputation as a thorough and demanding inspector provided perfect cover for extended stays at remote facilities. Ellie Ross represented a particular challenge that excited him. Her SEAL training and combat experience made her different from his previous victims. Most of the women he had targeted were clerks, technicians, or support personnel who lacked the training and confidence to resist effectively. But Ellie was a warrior, and Kane relished the opportunity to break down her defenses and demonstrate his power over even the military's most elite personnel. He had studied her personnel file extensively before his arrival. Born in rural Montana, Ellie had enlisted immediately after high school and had distinguished herself in basic training and subsequent military education courses. Her psychological evaluations noted exceptional resilience, problem-solving ability, and leadership potential. Her physical fitness scores were in the top percentile for all personnel, male or female. Most impressively, she had been one of only 3 women to successfully complete SEAL training in the past 5 years. Kane's initial approach had been subtle and professional. He had arrived at the station with proper documentation and had conducted legitimate equipment inspections for the first day. His questions about station operations were thorough and appropriate, and his evaluation of Ellie's performance was professionally complimentary. She had maintained the facility in exemplary condition, and her meteorological data collection was flawless. But by the second day, Kane had begun testing boundaries. His comments about the challenges of isolated living had gradually shifted to more personal topics. He had asked about her relationships, her future career plans, and her adjustment to life at high altitude. When she had deflected these questions professionally, he had pressed harder, using his rank to justify the intrusive inquiries. During equipment demonstrations, Kane had positioned himself closer than necessary, occasionally allowing his hand to brush against hers or his body to make contact. When Ellie had stepped away to maintain appropriate distance, he had followed, claiming the need for closer inspection of her work. His eyes had lingered on her figure, and his compliments had become increasingly inappropriate. The weather station's layout worked to Kane's advantage. The small living space made it impossible to avoid close contact, and the communications equipment required coordination that provided opportunities for physical proximity. The isolated location meant that any confrontation would be private, with no witnesses to contradict his version of events. Kane had used similar tactics successfully at other remote installations, and he had no reason to believe this situation would be any different. What Kane failed to understand was that Ellie's SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of threat assessment. She had recognized his predatory behavior immediately, and had begun implementing defensive strategies from the moment his true intentions became clear. Her training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, to document potential threats, and to prepare multiple response options for dangerous situations. Ellie had subtly adjusted her daily routine to minimize opportunities for Kane to isolate her. She had ensured that all interactions took place in areas with multiple exit routes, and had positioned emergency equipment within easy reach. Her communications with headquarters had included coded references to Kane's presence that would alert supervisors if she failed to check in as scheduled. Most importantly, she had mentally prepared herself for the possibility that Kane might escalate his behavior to physical assault. The morning of the third day had begun normally, with routine equipment checks and weather data collection. Kane had seemed more agitated than usual, his questions more aggressive and his behavior more erratic. Ellie had sensed that he was building towards some kind of confrontation, and she had prepared herself accordingly. Her SEAL training had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct was screaming that Kane was about to make his move. As the morning progressed, Kane's behavior had become increasingly bold. His comments about her appearance had crossed clearly into sexual harassment, and his physical proximity had become overtly threatening. When Ellie had attempted to maintain professional distance, Kane had used his authority to order her compliance, claiming that his inspection required her full cooperation. The confrontation had been building for 3 days, and both participants knew that it was about to reach its climax. Kane believed that his superior rank, physical size, and isolated location gave him complete control over the situation. He was confident that Ellie would submit to his demands rather than risk her military career by filing charges against a respected colonel. He had no idea that he was about to face an O. The moment came at 13:47 hours, just after the midday weather transmission had been completed. Ellie was conducting routine maintenance on the atmospheric pressure sensors when Kane approached from behind, his footsteps deliberately quiet on the station's metal flooring. The thin mountain air carried sound differently than at sea level, but her SEAL training had sharpened her hearing to detect even the slightest acoustic changes in her environment. Kane's reflection was visible in the polished surface of the equipment housing, allowing Ellie to track his movement without appearing to notice his approach. She continued her work methodically, her hands steady as she calibrated the sensitive instruments, but every muscle in her body was coiled and ready for action. The high altitude that had initially challenged her breathing had become an advantage after weeks of acclimatization, while Kane, despite his 3 days at elevation, was still dealing with the effects of oxygen deprivation. "Lieutenant Ross," Kane's voice carried a tone of authority mixed with something far more sinister. "I need to speak with you about some irregularities in your performance reports." The lie came easily to him, years of practice having made deception a natural part of his predatory toolkit. He positioned himself between Ellie and the main exit, a tactical move that had worked effectively in previous encounters with other victims. Ellie straightened slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "What irregularities would those be, sir?" Her voice remained professional, but her peripheral vision was already mapping escape routes and identifying potential weapons within reach. The station's confined space contained numerous tools and equipment that could be used if necessary, and her training had taught her to weaponize any environment. Kane stepped closer, his bulk filling the narrow space between equipment racks. At 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, he had used his physical presence to intimidate countless subordinates over the years. His gray eyes fixed on Ellie with predatory intensity, and his voice dropped to what he probably was a seductive whisper. "I think we both know this isn't really about performance reports, Lieutenant. You've been alone up here for 6 weeks. That must be very lonely for a woman like you." The threat was unmistakable now, and Ellie's training kicked into high gear. Her breathing remained steady despite the adrenaline surge, and her stance shifted almost imperceptibly into a defensive position. The months of SEAL conditioning had programmed automatic responses into her muscle memory, and she could feel her body preparing for combat even as her mind calculated tactical options. "I believe our conversation should remain professional, Colonel," Ellie replied, taking a step back toward the communications console. The movement was subtle but purposeful, positioning her closer to the emergency beacon, while maintaining multiple escape routes. Her voice carried no trace of fear, only professional courtesy masking deadly preparation. Kane misinterpreted her calm demeanor as submission and moved closer, his confidence growing. "Professional, is that what you call hiding up here on this mountain, playing with weather instruments? A woman with your attributes could have much more interesting assignments if she was willing to be cooperative." His hand reached out toward her shoulder, the gesture designed to establish physical distance and test her resistance. The moment Kane's fingers made contact with her uniform, Ellie's training took over completely. Her hand snapped up in a lightning-fast defensive movement, grabbing his wrist and applying precise pressure to the nerve cluster at the base of his palm. The technique, learned during countless hours of close-quarters combat training, sent immediate pain signals shooting up Kane's arm, while simultaneously disrupting his balance. Kane's eyes widened in shock and rage. Throughout his career of predatory behavior, no one had ever physically resisted his advances. The sudden reversal of power dynamics caught him completely off guard, and his military training warred with his predatory instincts. Years of assuming authority and control had left him unprepared for actual combat, particularly against an opponent whose training far exceeded his own. "You little bitch," Kane snarled, his professional mask finally slipping completely. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I can destroy your career with a single phone call. No one will believe a word you say against me." His free hand moved toward his belt, where military personnel typically carried various tools and equipment. The gesture was meant to be threatening, but it also revealed his complete misunderstanding of the tactical situation. Ellie maintained her grip on his wrist while assessing the escalating threat. Kane's movement toward his belt suggested he might be reaching for a weapon, which would justify escalating her own defensive response. Her training had covered numerous scenarios involving superior officers who abused their authority, and the protocols were clear when faced with imminent physical threat. Appropriate defensive force was not only authorized but required. "Colonel, you need to step back and reconsider your actions," Ellie said, her voice remaining steady despite the dangerous situation. "This confrontation will not end the way you expect it to." The warning was both professional courtesy and tactical communication, establishing clear boundaries while preparing for whatever escalation might follow. Kane's response was to attempt a grabbing motion with his free hand, trying to seize Ellie's arm and physically overpower her. The move was crude and predictable, the kind of bullying tactic that might work against an untrained victim, but was hopelessly inadequate against someone with advanced combat training. His assumption that superior rank and physical size would guarantee victory revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of military combat principles. The space around them was cramped but manageable for someone trained in close-quarters combat. The equipment racks provided both obstacles and opportunities, while the metal flooring offered solid footing for advanced martial arts techniques. The high-altitude environment that had been slowly sapping Kane's strength for 3 days was having no effect on Ellie's performance,
giving her a significant physiological advantage in any extended confrontation. As Kane's grabbing hand approached her arm, Ellie knew that the situation had crossed the line from harassment into attempted assault. Her training, her oath to defend herself and others, and her determination to never be anyone's victim all aligned in this crucial moment. The colonel had made his choice, and now she would make hers.
At 2,000 meters above sea level, the atmospheric pressure was roughly 80% of what it would be at sea level, meaning every breath contained significantly less oxygen than Kane's body was accustomed to processing. While Ellie had spent 6 weeks acclimatizing to these conditions, gradually building up her red blood cell count and adjusting her cardiovascular system to operate efficiently in the thin air, Kane had arrived just 3 days earlier with no preparation for the physiological challenges of high-altitude operations. The effects of oxygen deprivation were now working dramatically in Ellie's favor. Kane's damaged nose was forcing him to breathe through his mouth, making each breath even less efficient. His broken cartilage was swelling rapidly, further restricting airflow just when his body needed oxygen most desperately. The solar plexus strike had disrupted his diaphragm's normal rhythm, making deep breathing nearly impossible, while the impact with the equipment console had likely bruised his ribs, causing pain with every breath attempt. Ellie could see the physiological stress building in Kane's system. His face was taking on a grayish pallor, and his movements were becoming increasingly sluggish as his oxygen-starved muscles struggled to respond to his commands. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air, and his hands were beginning to shake from the combination of adrenaline, injury, and hypoxia. SEAL training had included extensive high-altitude operations, teaching Ellie to recognize and exploit the tactical advantages that elevation could provide. She had learned to use thin air as a weapon against opponents who weren't properly acclimatized, understanding that oxygen deprivation affected cognitive function, reaction time, and muscular coordination. Every second that passed was weakening Kane while leaving her combat effectiveness unchanged. Kane's hand found what he was looking for on his belt, a military-issue knife with a 4-inch blade. The weapon had been standard equipment for his inspection visit, justified as a utility tool for equipment maintenance and emergency situations. But the way he drew it from its sheath made his intentions unmistakably clear. His eyes, now bloodshot from the combination of injury and oxygen deprivation, fixed on Ellie with murderous intent. "You want to fight?" Kane rasped, his voice thick with blood and rage. "Let's see how tough your SEAL training is against 30 years of military experience." He raised the knife in what he probably thought was a threatening gesture, but his hand was shaking badly enough that the blade wavered noticeably. His breathing was becoming increasingly labored, each word requiring precious oxygen that his body couldn't spare. Ellie assessed the new threat level with cold calculation. A knife was a serious escalation, but Kane's deteriorating condition made him more dangerous to himself than to her. His grip on the weapon was unsteady, his stance was compromised by his injuries, and his oxygen-deprived brain was clearly not processing tactical information effectively. The altitude that had been her ally was now becoming her decisive advantage. "Colonel, you need to put down the weapon and seek medical attention," Ellie said, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Your injuries require treatment, and the altitude is affecting your judgment. This confrontation ends now, one way or another." The warning was both professional courtesy and tactical communication, giving Kane one last opportunity to surrender before she was forced to escalate her own response. Kane's answer was a clumsy lunge with the knife, aimed at Ellie's midsection. The attack was telegraphed and poorly executed, the product of an oxygen-starved brain trying to coordinate complex movements at an altitude his body couldn't handle. His forward momentum was compromised by his injured ribs, and his grip on the knife was weakening as his hypoxic muscles began to fail. Ellie sidestepped the lunge with fluid grace, her 6 weeks of high-altitude conditioning allowing her to move with full speed and coordination while Kane struggled with basic motor functions. As his knife hand passed by her, she grabbed his wrist with both hands and continued his forward momentum, using a classic Aikido technique to redirect his attack energy against him. The knife came free from Kane's weakened grip as Ellie applied precise pressure to the nerve points in his wrist. The weapon clattered harmlessly across the station's metal flooring as Kane's oxygen-starved muscles lost their ability to maintain a secure grip. His forward momentum carried him past Ellie and directly toward the station's main support beam, a steel column designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. Kane's shoulder struck the support beam with a sickening crunch. The impact drove what little air remained in his lungs out through his damaged nose and mouth, sending him crashing to the floor in a gasping, writhing heap. His left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly dislocated at the shoulder joint, while his already labored breathing became even more desperate as his body struggled to process the new trauma. The altitude was now Kane's worst enemy. His cardiovascular system, already stressed by 3 days at elevation and compromised by multiple injuries, couldn't deliver enough oxygen to support his body's trauma response. His vision was beginning to tunnel as hypoxia affected his brain function, and his muscle coordination was deteriorating rapidly as his nervous system prioritized vital organs over voluntary movement. Ellie stood over Kane's writhing form, her breathing still controlled and steady despite the violent confrontation. Her body had adapted completely to the high-altitude environment, allowing her to maintain full combat effectiveness while her opponent succumbed to the combined effects of injury and oxygen deprivation. The physiological advantage that altitude provided had turned what might have been a difficult fight into a one-sided demonstration of superior training and preparation. Kane tried to push himself upright with his good arm, but the effort sent waves of pain through his dislocated shoulder and further depleted his already insufficient oxygen reserves. His face was now taking on a distinctly blue tinge around the lips and fingernails, classic signs of severe hypoxia that indicated his body was struggling to maintain basic life functions. The confrontation was effectively over, but Ellie knew that Kane's condition was becoming genuinely life-threatening. The combination of his injuries and the high-altitude environment created a medical emergency that required immediate intervention, regardless of his predatory behavior or criminal intentions. Kane's dislocated shoulder was sending waves of agony through his oxygen-starved nervous system, but his predatory rage was stronger than his survival instincts. As he struggled to his feet using only his good arm, his face twisted with a combination of pain, humiliation, and murderous intent that made him genuinely dangerous despite his deteriorating condition. Years of using his authority to victimize subordinates had created a psychological profile that couldn't accept defeat, especially from someone he viewed as inferior. The thin mountain air that had been working against him was now becoming a critical factor in his decision-making process. Hypoxia was affecting his prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for judgment and impulse control, making him increasingly irrational and unpredictable. His military training was warring with oxygen-deprived cognitive function, creating a dangerous combination of tactical knowledge and impaired thinking. "This isn't over," Kane gasped, his words slurred by the combination of his broken nose and hypoxic confusion. "You think you're so smart with your SEAL training? I've been killing people since before you were born." His good hand fumbled at his belt, searching for additional weapons or equipment that might give him an advantage in the confrontation. Ellie maintained her defensive stance while carefully observing Kane's deteriorating condition. Her medical training, a standard component of SEAL preparation, allowed her to recognize the signs of severe altitude sickness combined with traumatic injury. Kane's bluish skin tone, labored breathing, and increasingly erratic behavior indicated that his body was approaching systemic failure. He needed immediate medical evacuation, but his continued aggression made treatment impossible. Kane found what he was looking for, a military-issue tactical pen designed for writing in extreme conditions, but capable of being used as a weapon in desperate situations. The titanium construction and pointed tip made it potentially lethal in the right hands, though Kane's compromised condition made effective use unlikely. His grip on the improvised weapon was unsteady, and his damage depth perception made accurate targeting nearly impossible. The station's confined space worked to Ellie's advantage as Kane attempted another attack. His movements were becoming increasingly sluggish as his oxygen-deprived muscles struggled to respond to neural commands. The dislocated shoulder severely limited his range of motion, while his damaged ribs caused excruciating pain with every breath and movement. His tactical awareness was deteriorating rapidly as hypoxia affected his ability to process spatial relationships and timing. Kane lunged forward with the tactical pen, aiming for Ellie's neck in what he probably thought was a killing blow. But his oxygen-starved brain miscalculated the distance, his injured body moved too slowly, and his damaged coordination made the attack clumsy and predictable. Ellie had seen the strike coming from the moment Kane's muscles began to tense, giving her plenty of time to prepare her response. She caught Kane's wrist as his hand approached her neck, her grip locking onto the nerve clusters that controlled finger strength. The tactical pen fell from his numbed fingers as she applied precise pressure to the radial nerve, temporarily paralyzing his hand and forearm. But rather than simply disarming him, Ellie decided it was time to end the confrontation permanently. Using Kane's forward momentum and his compromised balance, she executed a perfect hip throw that sent his 200-pound frame crashing into the station's emergency equipment locker. The metal cabinet contained oxygen bottles, medical supplies, and survival gear, all secured behind reinforced steel doors designed to withstand extreme weather conditions. Kane's body struck the locker with tremendous force, the impact echoing through the small station like a thunderclap. The collision was devastating. Kane's already damaged ribs took the full force of the impact against the steel cabinet, and the sound of bones cracking was clearly audible over his gasping screams. His left arm, already dislocated at the shoulder, was trapped beneath his body weight and twisted at an unnatural angle as he crashed to the floor. The combination of traumatic injury and severe altitude sickness pushed his cardiovascular system beyond its limits. Kane's right arm, the one he had been using to attack Ellie with the tactical pen, struck the corner of the radius and ulna bones in his forearm, snapped with an audible crack as his full body weight came down on the limb. The break was clean and complete, leaving his arm bent at a 90-degree angle where no joint should exist. The sight of his grotesquely broken arm seemed to finally penetrate Kane's oxygen-deprived consciousness. His eyes widened in shock and horror as he realized the extent of his injuries, and his predatory rage was suddenly replaced by genuine fear. The pain from multiple traumatic injuries was overwhelming his nervous system, while the high altitude made every breath a struggle for survival. Ellie stood over Kane's broken form, her breathing still controlled and steady despite the violent confrontation. Her SEAL training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, a superior officer using his authority to commit sexual assault, forcing her to defend herself with appropriate force. The law was clear about her rights in this situation, and the physical evidence would support her version of events completely. Kane tried to speak, but his oxygen-starved brain could no longer coordinate the complex muscular movements required for coherent speech. Blood from his broken nose had mixed with saliva and was running down his throat, making breathing even more difficult than the altitude alone would account for. His broken arm was sending constant pain signals to a nervous system that was already overloaded with trauma responses. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes from beginning to end, but those 5 minutes had completely destroyed Kane's career, his health, and his predatory confidence. The man who had entered the weather station believing himself to be in complete control was now lying broken and helpless on the floor, his body failing at 2,000 meters above sea level while his intended victim stood uninjured above him. Ellie reached for the emergency medical kit, knowing that despite Kane's criminal behavior, she had a professional obligation to provide life-saving treatment. His condition was critical, and without immediate intervention, the combination of traumatic injuries and severe altitude sickness could prove fatal within minutes. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation left the weather station in eerie silence, except for Kane's labored breathing and the sparking of damaged electrical equipment. Ellie's training kicked into medical mode as she assessed the tactical situation and began emergency treatment protocols. Despite Kane's predatory behavior and criminal assault, military law and basic human decency required her to provide life-saving medical care to prevent his death from traumatic injuries and severe altitude sickness.
Kane's condition was critical and deteriorating rapidly. His broken arm was causing severe blood loss as fractured bone fragments damaged surrounding tissue, while his dislocated shoulder was putting pressure on major blood vessels and nerves. The combination of traumatic injuries and severe hypoxia from the high altitude was creating a life-threatening medical emergency that required immediate intervention. Ellie opened the emergency medical kit with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through supplies she had inventoried dozens of times during her 6-week assignment. Military medical training was a core component of SEAL preparation, designed to enable operators to provide battlefield medicine in combat situations. She had treated gunshot wounds, explosive trauma, and environmental during training exercises, but this was her first real-world application of those skills. The first priority was controlling Kane's bleeding and stabilizing his broken arm. She retrieved a pressure bandage and emergency splinting materials, working quickly to immobilize the fractured limb and reduce further tissue damage. Kane's consciousness was fading in and out as his oxygen-starved brain struggled to maintain basic functions, making him less resistant to treatment, but also indicating the severity of his medical crisis. As she worked, Ellie's mind processed the tactical and legal implications of what had just occurred. Kane's assault had been witnessed by the station's security cameras, which recorded all activities for safety and accountability purposes. The footage would clearly show his predatory approach, his escalating harassment, his drawing of weapons, and his multiple attempts to physically and sexually assault her. Her defensive actions would be completely justified under military law and criminal statutes. The broken weather monitoring equipment represented thousands of dollars in damage, but the destruction had been caused by Kane's body impacting the console during her defensive throw. The station's maintenance logs would show that all equipment had been functioning normally until the moment Kane crashed into it. Her actions in defending herself could not be considered excessive force, given that he had been armed and attempting sexual assault. Kane's breathing was becoming increasingly shallow and irregular, indicating that his cardiovascular system was approaching complete failure. The high altitude that had been her tactical advantage was now threatening his life as his injured body couldn't process the limited oxygen available at 2,000 meters elevation. She needed to get him to a lower altitude immediately, or risk having a death on her hands. The emergency communication system was partially functional despite the damage to the main console. Ellie activated the distress beacon while continuing to treat Kane's injuries, sending out an automated signal that would alert rescue services to the medical emergency at the weather station. The nearest military medical facility was over an hour away by helicopter, but emergency evacuation procedures were well established for remote installations. As she stabilized Kane's broken arm, Ellie noticed something that made her blood run cold. Hidden beneath his uniform shirt, partially visible now that his clothing had been disheveled during the fight, was a small digital camera. The device was still recording, its red light blinking steadily as it captured everything that had occurred in the station. Kane had been planning to document his, probably for his own twisted gratification, or possibly as blackmail material against his victim. The discovery of the recording device revealed the depth of Kane's predatory planning and criminal. This hadn't been a spontaneous act of harassment that had escalated beyond his intentions. He had come to the weather station with premeditated plans to sexually assault her and document the attempt. The camera would have captured his verbal threat, his drawing of weapons, and his multiple attempts at physical assault, providing ironclad evidence of his criminal behavior. Ellie carefully removed the camera from Kane's uniform, preserving it as evidence while ensuring that the recording continued. The device would be crucial in any legal proceedings that followed, proving beyond any doubt that Kane had been the aggressor and that her defensive actions had been completely justified. Military prosecutors would have an Basutragishaba for facilitation to Safed. The irony wasn't lost on her that Kane's own recording would be the evidence that destroyed him. His arrogance and criminal intent had led him to document his own downfall, creating a permanent creating the butterwort de for the butter the was would been der Vergener, that selt, but butchrick been der for or be it, beturbt in toot, beturbt in toot, beturbt in bull, 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 I butchrick bin de bisgeben de furb bin de toot, the tote in the camera that was meant to be a tool of victimization would instead become an instrument of justice. Kane's condition continued to deteriorate as shock and hypoxia took their toll on his traumatized body. His pulse was becoming thready and irregular, and his skin was taking on the waxy pallor that indicated circulatory collapse. Despite her anger at his criminal behavior, Ellie worked frantically to keep him alive, applying advanced trauma protocols she had learned during SEAL medical training. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance indicated that the emergency evacuation team was approaching. The rescue crew would consist of military medical personnel trained in high-altitude operations, equipped with oxygen supplies and advanced life support equipment that could stabilize Kane long enough to transport him to definitive medical care at a lower elevation facility. As she continued emerging, every detail would need to be documented precisely, from Kane's initial inappropriate comments to his final assault with a weapon. The physical evidence, witness statements, and video documentation would tell a clear story of predatory behavior met with appropriate defensive force by a trained military operator who had exhausted all other options.
The distinctive sound of military helicopter rotors cutting through the thin mountain air grew steadily louder as the emergency medical evacuation team approached the weather station. The UH-60 Black Hawk, configured for high-altitude medical transport, was one of only a few aircraft capable of operating effectively at 2,000 meters elevation while carrying the specialized equipment needed for trauma stabilization and patient transport. Ellie continued applying pressure to Kane's wounds while monitoring his vital signs through techniques learned during SEAL medical training. His pulse was weak and irregular, his breathing shallow and labored, and his skin color indicated severe shock combined with altitude-induced hypoxia. She had managed to stabilize his broken arm and control most of the bleeding, but his overall condition remained critical and would require immediate evacuation to a facility equipped for major trauma treatment. The helicopter's approach was complicated by the weather station's location on a narrow mountain ledge with limited landing space. The pilot would need to execute a precision landing in challenging wind conditions while dealing with the reduced aircraft performance that high altitude imposed on rotorcraft operations. The thin air that had been Ellie's tactical advantage during the confrontation was now making rescue operations significantly more difficult and dangerous. Through the station's reinforced windows, Ellie could see the Black Hawk maneuvering carefully toward the designated landing zone. The aircraft's medical crew would include a flight surgeon, trauma specialist, and high-altitude operations expert, all trained to provide advanced life support in challenging environmental conditions. Their arrival would shift her role from primary caregiver to witness and evidence custodian. The helicopter touched down with practiced precision, its rotors continuing to spin as the medical team disembarked with their equipment. The crew moved with military efficiency, their actions coordinated by months of training in emergency response procedures. The flight surgeon, identified by his medical insignia and officer's rank, took immediate control of the scene while his team began setting up advanced life support equipment. Lieutenant Ross, the flight surgeon, called over the noise of the helicopter. "I'm Major Williams, flight surgeon. What's the patient's status and how did these injuries occur?" His professional demeanor indicated that he was focused on medical treatment rather than the circumstances that had led to Kane's condition, but Ellie knew that questions about the incident would come later. "Colonel Kane has multiple traumatic injuries including a compound fracture of the right forearm, dislocated left shoulder, and probable rib fractures. Ellie reported with military precision. He's been unconscious or semi-conscious for the past 20 minutes, showing signs of severe hypoxia and shock. I've controlled bleeding and immobilized the arm fracture, but he needs immediate evacuation for definitive treatment. Major Williams nodded as his team connected Kane to portable monitors and began establishing intravenous access. Good work on the initial treatment, Lieutenant. The altitude is definitely working against us here. We'll need to get him down to sea level as quickly as possible. His team worked with practiced efficiency, preparing Kane for transport while maintaining his fragile vital signs. As the medical team stabilized Kane for evacuation, a second helicopter appeared in the distance. This aircraft carried the military police investigators who would be responsible for documenting the scene and collecting evidence related to the incident. The arrival of criminal investigators indicated that preliminary reports had already identified potential criminal behavior requiring formal investigation. The MP helicopter landed adjacent to the medical aircraft, and a team of investigators disembarked with cameras, evidence collection equipment, and forensic specialists. Their leader, identified as Captain Martinez by her military police insignia, approached Ellie with professional courtesy but obvious concern about the serious nature of the incident that had occurred at the remote weather station. "Lieutenant Ross, I'm Captain Martinez, CID. We need to secure this scene and document everything related to Colonel Kane's injuries. Are you injured and do you require medical attention?" Her questions followed standard protocol for investigating incidents involving potential criminal activity, ensuring that all parties received appropriate care while preserving evidence integrity. "I'm uninjured, Captain," Ellie replied. "I have significant physical evidence and documentation related to the incident, including video recording that Colonel Kane was making during his assault. The camera is still recording and contains crucial evidence of his criminal behavior and my defensive actions." She handed over Kane's recording device, explaining its significance to the investigation. Captain Martinez accepted the camera with obvious recognition of its importance. "This will be crucial evidence, Lieutenant. We'll need a complete statement from you, but first let's ensure you understand your rights and get initial medical clearance. Even if you're not visibly injured, the stress of this incident may have physical effects that aren't immediately apparent." The medical team completed their preparation of Kane for evacuation, loading him onto a specialized transport stretcher equipped with high-altitude life support systems. His condition remained critical but stable enough for transport to the military medical center where trauma surgeons were standing by to treat his multiple injuries. The broken arm would require extensive surgical repair while his other injuries would need careful monitoring and treatment. As the medical helicopter prepares for departure, Major Williams approached Ellie with obvious professional respect. "Your medical treatment probably saved his life, Lieutenant. Despite whatever happened here, you followed proper protocols and provided appropriate care. That speaks well of your training and care." His acknowledgement carried the weight of professional recognition from a senior medical officer. The departure of the medical helicopter left the weather station much quieter, but the arrival of the investigation team meant that Ellie's ordeal was far from over. She would need to provide detailed statements, undergo medical and psychological evaluation, and cooperate with what would likely be a lengthy criminal investigation. The physical evidence strongly supported her version of events, but military justice procedures were thorough and time-consuming. Captain Martinez began establishing a formal crime scene perimeter around the damaged equipment and bloodstains that marked the locations where the confrontation had occurred. Military forensic specialists would document every detail, from the broken weather monitoring console to the improvised weapons that Kane had used in his assault. The investigation would be comprehensive and professional, ensuring that justice was served regardless of Kane's rank or connections. As investigators began their work, Ellie realized that her life was about to change dramatically. The incident would generate significant attention within military circles, potentially making her a symbol of resistance against military sexual assault. Her actions in defending herself had been justified and heroic, but the publicity and legal proceedings would be challenging in ways that combat training had never prepared her for. The investigation into Colonel Kane's assault and Ellie's defensive actions unfolded with military precision over the following weeks. The weather station had been transformed into a crime scene, with forensic specialists documenting every detail of the confrontation through photographs, measurements, and evidence collection. The damaged meteorological equipment, bloodstains on the floor, and improvised weapons all told a clear story of predatory behavior met with appropriate defensive force. Captain Martinez and her criminal investigation team had worked methodically through the physical evidence, witness statements, and most importantly, the video recording that Cain himself had been making during his assault attempt. The 43 minutes of footage showed Cain's entire approach from his initial inappropriate comments through his escalation to physical and sexual assault, his use of weapons, and his ultimate defeat by Ellie's superior training and tactical skills. The recording had been a devastating piece of evidence against Cain, but it also revealed something far more disturbing about his predatory behavior. Digital forensic analysis of his personal equipment and military-issued devices uncovered a pattern of similar recordings dating back over 15 years. Cain had been documenting his assaults on female military personnel throughout his career, creating a library of criminal evidence that he apparently kept for personal gratification. Military prosecutors had identified at least 12 other victims over Cain's 30-year career, women who had been too intimidated by his rank and connections to report his crimes or who had tried to report them only to have their careers destroyed in retaliation. The digital evidence provided ironclad proof of systematic sexual predation that had been protected by Cain's network of accomplices and enablers within the military hierarchy. The scope of Cain's criminal behavior had attracted attention at the highest levels of military command. The Secretary of Defense had ordered a comprehensive review of how Cain's predatory behavior had gone undetected and unpunished for so long. Congressional hearings were being planned to examine the systemic failures that had allowed a senior officer to victimize subordinates while advancing through the ranks to positions of greater authority and access to victims. Ellie found herself at the center of a media firestorm as news of the incident leaked to civilian media outlets. Headlines describing her successful defense against a predatory colonel had made her a symbol of resistance against military sexual assault, while also highlighting the specialized training that had enabled her to survive an encounter that might have destroyed other victims. Interview requests flooded in from news organizations, documentary, filmmakers, and advocacy groups. The legal proceedings against Cain had moved swiftly once the evidence was compiled. Military prosecutors had filed charges including attempted rape, assault with a deadly weapon, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and destruction of government property. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the pattern of behavior revealed by digital forensics would likely result in additional charges related to his other victims. Cain's condition following his injuries had stabilized enough for him to be transferred from intensive care to a secure medical ward where he would await court-martial proceedings. His broken arm had required multiple surgeries and would never regain full function, while his other injuries had healed with varying degrees of success. The high-altitude trauma had caused permanent neurological damage that would affect his cognitive function for the rest of his life. The military defense attorney assigned to Cain's case had approached Ellie's legal team about a potential plea bargain that would avoid the publicity and trauma of a full court-martial. Cain was prepared to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for a recommendation of 25 years in military prison, acknowledging that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that his pattern of predatory behavior made any defense strategy hopeless. Ellie had rejected the plea bargain proposal, insisting that Cain face full accountability through public court-martial proceedings. Her decision was motivated partly by a desire for complete justice, but also by recognition that other victims deserved to see their attacker face full consequences for decades of criminal behavior. The transparency of military court proceedings would also help expose the systemic failures that had protected Cain throughout his career. The court-martial was scheduled to take place at Joint Base Lewis McChord with extensive media coverage planned due to the high-profile nature of the case and its implications for military sexual assault policy. Ellie would testify as the primary witness, describing Cain's predatory approach, his escalation to physical assault, and her defensive actions that had ultimately saved her life and ended his criminal career. Her testimony would be supported by the video evidence, forensic analysis of the crime scene, medical records documenting Cain's injuries, and expert analysis of the tactical situation that had developed during the confrontation. Military prosecutors were confident that the evidence would result in conviction on all charges, with a sentence that would ensure Cain spent the rest of his life in military prison.
The broader implications of the case were already being felt throughout the military justice system. New policies were being implemented to better protect whistleblowers who reported sexual assault, while training programs were being expanded to help personnel recognize and respond to predatory behavior by superior officers. Ellie's successful defense had demonstrated that proper training and preparation could enable potential victims to protect themselves against even experienced predators. Awards and commendations were being prepared to recognize Ellie's courage and professionalism during the incident. Her actions in defending herself while also providing life-saving medical care to her attacker demonstrated the highest standards of military conduct and professional ethics. She would likely receive the Soldier's Medal for Heroism not involving combat, along with various other recognition for her service and bravery. The weather station where the confrontation had occurred was being converted into a training facility where military personnel could learn about sexual assault prevention and response. The site would serve as a permanent reminder that predatory behavior would not be tolerated within military ranks and that proper training and preparation could enable anyone to defend themselves against criminal assault regardless of the attacker's rank or authority. As Ellie prepared for the upcoming court-martial and the media attention that would follow, she reflected on how a routine assignment at a remote weather station had changed not only her life but potentially the entire military's approach to preventing and responding to sexual assault. The court-martial of Colonel Bradley Kane opened 6 months after the incident at the weather station, drawing national attention to issues of military sexual assault and the systemic failures that had protected predatory officers for decades. The courtroom at Joint Base Lewis McChord was packed with media representatives, military personnel, and advocates for sexual assault survivors, all witnessing what many hoped would be a turning point in military justice. Ellie took the witness stand wearing her dress uniform, her ribbons and decorations, telling the story of an exemplary military career that had been interrupted by Kane's criminal behavior. Her testimony was clear, precise, and devastating as she described the 3 days of escalating harassment, Kane's predatory approach, and the confrontation that had ended with his defeat and arrest. The video evidence played during her testimony left no doubt about Kane's criminal intent or the justification for her defensive actions. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Digital forensics experts testified about the pattern of recorded assaults found on Kane's devices, while other victims courageously came forward to describe similar attacks they had endured throughout his career. Medical experts explained how the high-altitude environment had worked against Kane during the confrontation, while military training specialists analyzed the tactical superiority that Ellie's SEAL preparation had provided in the life-threatening situation. Kane's defense team had little to work with given the video evidence and physical proof of his crimes. Their strategy focused on portraying his behavior as aberrant rather than criminal, suggesting that career stress and personal problems had led to poor judgment rather than predatory assault. The argument fell flat as prosecutors presented evidence of systematic predation dating back 15 years, demonstrating clear criminal intent rather than isolated poor decisions. The verdict came after just 4 hours of deliberation. Kane was found guilty on all charges, including attempted rape, assault with deadly weapons, abuse of military authority, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The military judge sentenced him to 40 years in military prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life paying for his crimes against fellow service members. The sentencing phase included victim impact statements from women whose careers and lives had been damaged by Kane's predatory behavior. Their testimonies revealed the true scope of his criminal legacy and the courage required for them to come forward after years of silence. Ellie's successful defense had given them hope that justice was possible, even against powerful predators who seemed untouchable within military hierarchies. Following the court-martial, Ellie received numerous awards and commendations recognizing her courage and professionalism. The Soldier's Medal for Heroism was accompanied by commendations for her medical treatment of Kane despite his criminal behavior, demonstrating the highest standards of military ethics and professional conduct. Her actions had exemplified the best values of military service while protecting herself and potentially countless future victims. The incident sparked comprehensive reforms within military sexual assault prevention and response programs. New training protocols were implemented to help personnel recognize predatory behavior, while reporting procedures were strengthened to protect whistleblowers from retaliation. The high-altitude weather station where the confrontation occurred was converted into a specialized training facility where military personnel learned self-defense techniques and legal procedures related to sexual assault prevention. Congressional hearings into Kane's case revealed systemic failures that had allowed him to victimize subordinates while advancing through military ranks. Multiple officers were disciplined or removed from positions of authority for their roles in covering up complaints against Kane or retaliating against his victims. The investigations led to policy changes designed to prevent similar failures in the future and ensure that all reports of sexual misconduct receive proper investigation. Ellie's story became a symbol of resistance against military sexual assault, inspiring other potential victims to seek proper training and preparation, while encouraging survivors to report predatory behavior regardless of their attacker's rank or connections. Speaking engagements at military installations and civilian organizations allowed her to share lessons learned from her experience while advocating for continued improvements in prevention and response programs. The specialized training she had received as a SEAL had been crucial to her survival, but Ellie recognized that not all military personnel would have access to such extensive preparation. She worked with training specialists to develop self-defense curricula that could be implemented across all military specialties, ensuring that every service member had basic skills needed to protect themselves against predatory behavior. Her military career continued with increased responsibilities and recognition of her leadership capabilities. The courage and professionalism she had demonstrated during the crisis led to accelerated promotions and assignments to positions where she could influence policy and training related to sexual assault prevention. Her unique perspective as both a trained warrior and assault survivor provided valuable insights into the challenges facing military personnel who encountered predatory behavior. Years later, the weather station incident continued to serve as a case study in military criminal justice courses and sexual assault prevention training. The combination of physical evidence, video documentation, and clear legal precedent provided a template for investigating and prosecuting similar cases. Kane's conviction had established important legal precedents about appropriate defensive force and the rights of military personnel to protect themselves against criminal assault by superior officers. The legacy of that confrontation at 2,000 meters above sea level extended far beyond one woman's successful defense against a predatory colonel. It had sparked systemic reforms, inspired countless survivors, and demonstrated that proper training and preparation could enable anyone to resist criminal behavior regardless of their attacker's apparent authority. Ellie Ross had not only saved herself but had helped protect countless future victims through her courage, preparation, and refusal to be silenced by military hierarchy. The mountain weather station, once an isolated outpost where predators believed they could act without consequences, had become a symbol of justice and the power of specialized training to protect the innocent from those who would abuse their authority. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.